This is CyberSound, your simplified and fundamentals-focused source for all things cybersecurity, with your hosts, Jason Pufall, Stephen Maresca, and Matt Fusaro.
Welcome to CyberSound. I'm your host, Jason, joined today by Steve Maresca and Matt Fusaro, as always. Hey, guys.
Hey. Hello.
So today we get to speak a little bit about the AI sensation that has swept everywhere, ChatGPT. I mean, honestly, it's been out maybe a month at this point, and we spent a lot of time in our house talking about it relative to sort of its implications in the academic space as my kids explored the efficacy and maybe the morality of using something like this. For those people who don't know what ChatGPT is, certainly go out and Google it now because it's really interesting. But it's an AI.
It's a chatbot.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say text generator, but that's so.
It's a natural language
AI,
right? So it deals in some type of language, primarily English right now. I'm actually not sure if it does other languages besides English.
Linguistically, honestly, all the same rules typically apply as long as your data
as long as they're exactly.
But that's a good. I actually haven't tried saying give me something in Italian. I wonder.
I'm sure it would do it.
It might.
Yeah, I think it will. And you can generate on almost anything, right? If it's as creative as the inputs that you give it. So in this case, we actually have written our podcast using ChatGPT, and we're going to read it for you. It will be shorter than our normal podcast, but just to give you a sense of what we fed it with initially, it was really three different inputs. It does do an update of a previously generated text sample with new data. So we write a copy for a 3-person podcast episode that discusses the impact that ChatGPT potentially has in information security. Discuss how it may be used to write phishing emails. It generated something, wanted a little bit more detail, so we said add information about impersonation. Again, it updated that. We wanted a little bit more detail, so we said add content about dynamic conversation generation for text messaging, phishing, and scamming. So we have I don't know, what is it, maybe looks to be a 3-minute episode that it created. I didn't tell it do it in 5,000 words. I gave it no parameters at all. So I think the question is, who wants to be host 1, host 2, host 3? Anybody?
I'll be 3.
You want to go last?
I'll go right in the middle.
Yeah. All right, fair enough. So I will be host 2. Sorry, host 1. You're right in the middle. Host 1. Hello and welcome to today's episode of CyberSound. In this episode, we'll be discussing the impact that AI-powered language models like ChatGPT have on information security, particularly when it comes to writing phishing emails, impersonation attacks, and dynamic conversation generation for text message phishing and scamming.
That's right. As AI technology advances, the potential for misuse increases. With language models like ChatGPT, it's becoming easier for attackers to craft highly sophisticated and convincing phishing emails that can trick even the savviest of users. Not only that, but these AI models can also be used to impersonate a trusted source, such as a known business, organization, or individual, and generate dynamic conversations to lure individuals into text message scams.
Absolutely. ChatGPT and similar models can be trained on vast amounts of text data, including examples of phishing emails, impersonation tactics, and text message scams. This means they can generate phishing emails and text messages that are indistinguishable from ones written by a human and even impersonate a trusted source with ease. The ability to generate dynamic conversations increases the chances of luring individuals into scams and stealing sensitive information.
The consequences of this are alarming. With more convincing phishing emails and impersonation attacks in circulation and the ability to create dynamic conversations for the text message scams, it's becoming increasingly difficult for individuals and organizations to protect themselves from these types of threats.
And that's why it's crucial for individuals and organizations to be aware of these types of threats and to take steps to protect themselves. This includes staying vigilant when opening emails and text messages, checking for suspicious links or attachments, verifying the authenticity of the sender before taking any action, and being cautious of emails or messages from sources claiming to be from a trusted entity. It's also important to be cautious of unsolicited text messages. even if they appear to be from a trusted source, and never provide sensitive information in response to a text message or a call.
There's no doubt that AI-powered language models like ChatGPT have the potential to revolutionize many industries, but it's important to consider the potential consequences and take steps to mitigate any risks. By staying informed and taking proactive measures, we can help protect ourselves and our information from these types of attacks.
Thank you for joining us today on CyberSound. We hope you found this discussion informative and thought-provoking. Until next time, stay safe and keep informed.
You didn't read outro music.
I did.
Yeah.
That's true. It did say
I'm upset.
there was intro music and outro music.
I just want to
specified.
acknowledge
that is true.
that ChatGPT was thoughtful enough to include that.
Well, so that is the interesting part. I said create a podcast, and it does know enough to do that. So you can tell it create a podcast, create a resume, write a screenplay. It will make a reasonable attempt at doing any of those things. But I think I hadn't read this out loud, and it was interesting to hear it out loud because it actually does feel generated. Isn't a fair way to put it, but it doesn't feel natural.
It's regurgitated.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
It's echoing back to you what you prompted, and that's the trouble. I mean, to some degree, it's only echoing what it's read. So it's synthesizing similar content, or content that it infers is similar, and then filling in the components that you gave it. And it does an okay job.
It's okay. But arguably, this is, honestly, I think one of the worst examples that I've seen it create. So I'm so glad we got to read it on air. But I do feel like, we threw a resume together for my 16-year-old son who doesn't have tons of skills at 16, and it wrote a fine resume that he could then take and spend some time just updating and improving, right? And that, I think, is the value of it. If you take it purely from what it initially produces, you get something that sounds like what we just read.
Yeah.
But if you take this and say, well, this is a reasonable first draft that maybe I can polish up and add to and experiment with, it's a great way to do that.
Yeah, that's why programmers especially need to be very careful using something like this.
Oh, yes.
It introduces a lot of great things that you wouldn't have normally gotten from just, trusting a source on Stack Overflow or something like that, or, just Googling for it. But it does also introduce things that just aren't correct. Right.
Or could have, copyright and other things that are absolutely derivative of whatever it learned to produce that result. So there are hidden dangers that lurk without any question.
I found it interesting, Jason, you shared, I guess there were some survey results. Was that correct?
Yeah, Educause. Yeah. I actually got an Educause survey, which clearly is, ChatGPT's implications in an academic environment focused. But I answered that this morning.
So I think one of the things I found really interesting was, so the question that was in the survey is, in general, what are your concerns related to generative AI? And one of the answers was that AI generated content becoming undistinguishable from humans was a concern. Isn't that kind of the whole point?
That is
Isn't that what everyone's been driving towards?
Right, that's the dream.
Right. I mean, obviously, we're concerned about that, and I think everyone's starting to understand there's some ethical reasons why it might be a problem in so many areas. But yeah, it's just interesting that now that it's getting closer, now we're afraid.
But even as phrase, that's not quite the root of it, right?
Yeah.
What's the threat of being indistinguishable? In my opinion, it's the air of authenticity and authority associated with well-structured, well-formed statements. Because most people who don't know, if they're seeking information about a subject and they encounter language that is framed as authoritative, they take it as such.
Right.
And that's the risk, in my opinion, because it may not be legitimate in any way. It's just constructed. That's what I'm most worried about. And I think it's about trust when most people frame it as well.
I find most people untrustworthy for the same reasons.
There is a real concern, though, with people taking the information as if it is truth. And
we have enough of a problem with that in other spheres.
We do. And young people, this is really, I'm drawing from my own experience, right? This is really compelling for young people who say, hey, I can use this to answer questions in class or help generate an essay. But the reality is it stopped getting data, I think, in 2021. So we've got a little gap, maybe for some of the historic stuff that they might be working on. It doesn't matter as much. But I'm also not seeing the follow-up review later to say, well, is what was written actually accurate? Right. There's just blind trust.
Right. Critical thinking is required for use of any tool like this. I mean, it harkens back to, as was some time ago, right? But references to, what you read on the internet isn't necessarily factual. I don't know if anyone recalls the Northwest tree octopus, but
it's not.
It's stuff like that. It requires thought, especially if it's being used actively in a professional context as a tool. Maybe it's a good starting place. Maybe it's an atrocious starting place. If it drew on material that is outdated and therefore, since that time, refuted or wholly invalidated for some reason on a factual basis, you don't know that if you're consuming something from that data set.
There was another survey that we had looked at that asked, in what areas are people most using ChatGPT? And I think the number one answer was marketing and advertising, which I was actually, honestly, I wasn't surprised in at all. I think there's such a push in some of the content-based marketing that a lot of companies do to get content out. And it's not easy for people to do that. Not everybody has a podcast that they can produce on a regular basis. Boy, how much easier can it get than just saying, talk about X product in X industry, in X amount of words, and get something you can edit. So you can certainly see that there, but then it also starts to water down the content that you see. I think There's some risk to that.
That response in terms of marketing and advertising was relative to ChatGPT, but other tools are actively in use for the same purpose of improving copy. Like Grammarly, as an example, has an advertisement about tone adjustments. Right. It's exactly the same type of technology, just applied a little differently. Some of that's useful. I think a lot of the sentiment analysis and so forth that has historically gone into advertising is a good match for a type of tool like this because it's exactly what you want out of something of this nature.
Yeah. Again, I think if you rely on it too heavily, you're going to fade into the background.
Of course.
Right? If everyone else is using it, eventually you're just like everybody else in your messaging and how it's structured because it's not going to change too much.
And it won't come up with new ideas necessarily.
Yeah, the creativity factor, not yet, is there.
Right.
Yeah, but this is, I think what has caused such a stir is just how much better this is than something that we saw 2 months ago. And so I think there's this real sense of it's going to evolve really quickly. And is it going to get to a point where you can then really modify something for tonality, for language adjustments, things like that?
I want to be careful about that in terms of time. These tools have existed for a long while.
They've existed.
The thing is that it's now uniquely accessible through ChatGPT. That's the threshold we're at. It's making these long existing data sets and capabilities more consumable. And maybe that's what is the transition needed to make them actually applicable for other industries. But
I'm interested to see what happens with because Microsoft put billions, I believe,
tons of investment,
actually making this a service on Azure, right? So I believe it's either this month, near the end of this month, or next month. It'll be available as a service, and it was something cheap too, like $20 something bucks a month. I could be wrong on that, but
the next 6 months should be interesting in several different areas.
Yeah. So, Matt, you made a comment around isn't this what we've all been asking for essentially as we talked about AI?
Yeah.
I'm kind of curious from the two of you, and I'll give my opinion. Do you consider this problematic? There's been a lot of noise about it. What are your opinions?
I think sure. I think it's problematic, but I mean most technical advances always were. Right? There was always a period of some fear. This is a really simple example, but I'm sure math classes got scared when calculators became really popular.
Right. And that's a common comparison.
It's not an earth-shattering comparison, but we adapted to that. There's going to be a more difficult adaptation here. I think there's way too many things that you can apply something like ChatGPT to, but it's just going to be an evolutionary period.
I have a similar thought. It is a general purpose tool. Therefore, it's ill-suited to very specific problems. And that's where machine learning and AI has historically thrived. And I'm talking like 30 years back with Gulf War logistics, which was a stunning success of early techniques of this sort. Today, some of the stuff that we've brought up, we've acknowledged machine learning and similar when talking about hype and throwing water on that in the past, because it was hype. But when talking about something like this, general purpose tools have a place, because earlier, far more finely honed models, they're very limited, right? And there's a big gulf between the types of references we're making, the types of things we've talked about in security products, for example, and a general purpose tool. I'm actually somewhat encouraged rather than fearful, and I'm really interested in what will develop over the next couple of years as more and more engineers play with the technology. I think there needs to be ethics attached to a lot of it.
Right.
But I think the possibilities are pretty substantial.
Yeah, I think that's what most people are worried about at this point are the ethics. Right. That's a hard problem to solve. I don't have answers for that one.
It is, and as a consumer, so I think the technology is really compelling, and I can't wait to see where it goes. But one of the concerns that I have is sort of understanding or recognizing the value of art as people move down this path. And you're already seeing it in the movie industry, where it's really difficult to tell if the actor you're seeing is 95 years old or 45 years old, because of all the technology they have to clean that up. So there's a lack of authenticity already in certain mediums, and I'm concerned that it's going to be harder to trust. This author wrote this book. Well, how much of it did they really write, and how much of it's really theirs? Or this artist crafted this piece of art. All right. Well, how heavily modified was it by something that was AI driven? And maybe that's just something that we're going to have to change our perception on.
Right.
Right. You can't associate art with an individual being so unique, perhaps, as we used to be able to.
Yeah.
Great cathedrals were built by craftsmen directed by an overseer of some kind, a master architect. They were very skilled craftsmen, and that architect could not have carved the stone. On some level, if an artist is simply coming up with a rule set and asking it to be executed by peers or tools, I don't think historically we've actually made a distinction that causes people to reject that art. And I don't think we'll see that today with anything of a common root in AI-generated material. We've seen it in game development. We've seen it in historical art from the 20s, the more structured art. A lot of it is very geometry-oriented. You could argue they're following the same sort of rule set that a computer happens to be executing when they're generating art. I don't see them as wildly deviant from each other.
Right. And on the same token, maybe movie credits shift towards the people making the graphics
Sure.
versus the actor actress, right?
Yeah, there'll be a lot of that, I have a feeling.
Yeah.
So I don't want everybody loves the word disruptive. I don't know if I want to call it a disruptive technology necessarily, but I think just the impact that it had in such a short time has been really interesting to watch. Right, the evolution from almost instantaneous outrage and the fear and the academic side to there's already some general acceptance to, well, the tool exists, so now we have to start thinking around what are expectations of students and how do we read things more critically, and what do we trust. There'll be a lot more discussions around that I'm really interested to see evolve over time. It's probably enough ChatGPT. Hopefully everybody loved the ChatGPT generated podcast. You can let us know what you think of that. But if you do have any, of course, as always, right, any questions or comments about this podcast or AI in general, Steve made the point that we've talked about it in the past, maybe not totally complimentary all the time. We're happy to engage further in it. I think there's a lot of room in this AI discussion, and this just brings it to the masses more than I think people are used to. So as always, thanks for listening. Appreciate your time.
We'd love to hear your feedback. Feel free to get in touch at Vancord on LinkedIn or on Twitter at Vancord Security. And remember, stay vigilant, stay resilient. This has been CyberSound.